Welcome to the Deep Dive. We take the source material you send us, we analyze it relentlessly, and then we figure out exactly what pieces of knowledge are most crucial for you to carry forward. Today we're getting into something pretty fundamental. It's the challenge of self-location. Finding yourself in a world that seems almost dedicated to standardized norms. Our main source is a really powerful essay, Locating Myself in a World That Keeps Rewriting Me, by Jaime Hoerricks, Ph.D.
And this is about the subtle stuff. We're not talking about, big political debates here.
Not at all. It's about that pervasive, quiet pressure to conform, the erosion that happens at the edges of our very complex internal lives.
That phrase, quiet erosion, is exactly where Hoerricks starts. Their mission here is incredibly focused, and I think we have to get the boundaries right from the jump.
Okay.
The objective is not to offer some universal framework or to define identities for other people. What they're doing is tracing a very specific and honestly a very unsettling pattern. How three seemingly benign forces, you've got polite language, institutions, and just general common sense, how they all converge.
And what happens when they converge?
Their primary function becomes to simplify, to minimize, and ultimately to overwrite complex lived experiences.
Overwrite. That word is so key. It implies a kind of subtle erasure, right?
Yeah.
A normalization process that's so ambient you don't even realize it's happening.
Exactly.
Not until you feel, just fundamentally disoriented. And for you, listening, if you're constantly managing this flood of information and external demands, this is a vital skill.
It is.
This deep dive is really about recognizing those mechanisms of pressure so you can stay oriented when, that pressure just becomes part of the air you breathe.
Let's start with the groundwork Hoerricks lays out because it really dictates everything that follows. They begin by defining the negative space, what the writing absolutely is not.
And they are so rigorous about this.
Yeah.
It's not a self-help guide.
Nope.
It's not a universal framework you should just apply to everyone. And it avoids trying to define anyone else's experience.
Right. And I think the most interesting exclusion is that it's not trying to adjudicate interpersonal conflict. It's not about diagnosing other people or deciding who's right or wrong.
Yeah.
And these boundaries aren't just incidental. They're like the armor protecting the project's integrity. By refusing to give general advice, the author forces the focus inward.
It stops it from becoming a weapon.
Exactly. It can't be a tool to judge your own conflicts with. So if we take away all those things it isn't, we're left with the positive space, the core purpose. Hoerricks says every piece they release is their personal attempting coherence.
Attempting coherence. I love that.
That's the whole project.
They're not trying to solve the world's problems. They're trying to make sense of the world as it's happening to them.
Yeah.
So what's the trigger? When does that need for coherence pop up and make them start writing?
The writing impulse, it seems to come from these friction points. The author turns to the page when things just stop adding up.
When your experience doesn't match the story you're being told.
Yes. When a pattern starts flickering at the edge of your awareness, something keeps happening, but it won't resolve into a neat little explanation. That's the moment.
So the goal is always a kind of internal cartography, just mapping what's happening to them in family, in community, at work.
All of it. They are mapping the gap between their complex internal reality and the external demands being placed on it.
Which brings us right to that core pattern in the essay, the mechanism of overwriting itself.
Precisely.
Okay, so let's talk about that confluence of forces you mentioned. Polite language, institutions, and common sense. How do they work together to do this?
They create a kind of a normalizing field. Think about common sense. It's society's default operating system, right?
Full of unspoken rules.
Exactly. Unspoken rules about how your career should look, how relationships should work, how you're supposed to manage your emotions. Then institutions codify that common sense into policy.
And polite language is the lubricant.
The lubricant. That's perfect.
Yeah.
It ensures that when that framework clashes with a complex life, the pressure is packaged as something constructive or kind, which makes it incredibly hard to even see, let alone resist.
That brings up a fascinating point, which the author calls polite harm, and the idea of invisible attackers.
Yes.
It's this paradox that the most harmful pressures are often administered with a smile, with the best of intentions.
It's subtle cruelty through standardization. An invisible attacker isn't a person who wants to hurt you. It might be a standardized HR form that makes you cram years of diverse experience into these neat linear job titles.
Or a university policy that has great accommodations for a physical disability, but just has no framework for nonlinear processing needs.
Exactly. The systems are polite. They claim to offer fairness, but they cause harm by just denying the existence of any complexity that doesn't fit their little boxes.
And the sources show that the author's recent work on relationships gave them a perfect real-time example of this. They said their life felt unusually pressured from multiple directions at once.
Yes. And the pressure was intense, but here's the key insight. It wasn't one big conflict. It was different conversations with friends, different professional expectations, different social contexts. But despite all those different sources, there was a consistent undertone, a unified friction that cut across everything.
So the person and place changed, but the demand stayed the same. And that common denominator, that recurring undertone, is the critical takeaway. It was a quiet, consistent demand.
It's the unifying theme. Hoerricks identified that in every single instance of this ambient pressure, the implicit instruction was always one of four things.
And this is where it gets so useful for, just parsing everyday social friction.
It really is.
Let's break them down, because they perfectly capture that emotional labor. The demand is always to adjust, soften, defer, or re-explain.
Let's take adjust. That's the demand to modify your behavior or your needs to fit the convenience of the external world. So if you need quiet to focus, but the common sense of the office is open plan and collaboration.
The pressure is on you to adjust, to mask your discomfort, to spend energy just acting normal or easygoing.
And look, the problem isn't adjustment itself. We all have to adjust to live in a society.
Of course.
The problem is when it becomes this fundamental, non-negotiable change to your own operating system, consuming huge amounts of energy just to seem okay.
Right. Then there's soften.
This one attacks emotional truth. Boundary setting. If you hold a firm boundary, say, about your working hours, and that inconveniences the system, the polite response is often, "You seem a little rigid," or "Could you just soften your tone?"
It's not a request to clarify the boundary.
No, it's a demand to dilute its integrity until it's basically useless.
That's powerful. It weaponizes social grace against self-preservation. The polite thing to do is to be less firm, less clear, and therefore easier to manage.
Absolutely. The third demand is to defer. This is the push to prioritize the institutional timeline or the needs of a linear system over your own internal rhythm.
So if you need a week to really process something and give a thoughtful analysis.
But the common sense of the workplace demands immediate updates. The pressure is to defer your own necessary process in favor of some accelerated and often worse external metric.
Yeah, that's the administrative drag of having a non-standard existence.
Yeah.
It's always an external deadline overriding an internal reality.
Which brings us to maybe the most exhausting one, re-explain.
Ugh, yes.
This is the constant recursive demand to justify why your life, your approach, your needs don't fit the neat category provided. If you have a nonlinear career, every job application forces you to re-explain the gaps.
If your identity is nuanced, every conversation pushes you to re-explain the basics.
Oh.
Over and over.
The cost of that is immense. You're perpetually on the defense, using your cognitive energy not to create or explore, but just to justify your right to exist as you are.
And you have to use the language of the very people who are trying to normalize you to do it.
That's it. That's the trap. The author found that across all these friction points, the goal of the pressure was consistently to make them either disappear into the norm or spend all their time justifying why they couldn't.
And this leads us to the author's own analytical method, which is where this deep dive gets really, really interesting. They connect their process of analysis directly to their identity.
They state it explicitly. They identify as an autistic, AuDHD gestalt processor. And it's important to understand what that means for the listener because it explains the unique insight they have.
Okay, so for our audience who are dedicated to getting knowledge quickly and thoroughly, we should define that. What does being an autistic AuDHD gestalt processor mean for their method?
It means their nervous system is basically calibrated to pick up details and patterns that linear systems are designed to just ignore.
Okay.
Being autistic can involve heightened sensory input, specialized pattern recognition. AuDHD, that's autistic and ADHD, can mean the brain is both intensely focused and constantly scanning. They're taking in massive, unfiltered amounts of data.
So, if most people are able to filter out the ambient noise of common sense and institutional friction, the author is experiencing it all at high volume.
At high volume, exactly. And the Gestalt processor part is about how that data gets organized. For them, understanding doesn't arrive step by step.
Not linear.
Not at all. Instead, they gather thousands of seemingly random data points until suddenly, bam. The brain presents the entire unified pattern, the gestalt flash. The conclusion arrives first. This is all one unified pressure.
Wow. So those flickering patterns from earlier, the things that refuse to resolve, the writing process itself is how they take that massive, nonlinear flash of understanding and translate it into a map.
A map that's navigable for them and for us. It's organizing that instantaneous coherence into a legible argument.
It's an act of necessary self-location.
It has to be. If the author didn't write, the understanding would just stay as this overwhelming, unified sensation of friction. The writing pulls apart the components, the polite language, the institutions, to show how they built that single unified feeling of being overwritten.
And for you, the learner, there's such a powerful insight there for your own work. If you're trying to understand a complex, conflicting situation like, say, figuring out why a big project is failing, the author's method reminds us that the linear path might actually be hiding the truth.
Right.
Complex understanding often requires you to track all those little flickering patterns until the full picture, the gestalt, just arrives. The right answer might not be found by following the instructions.
Precisely. So we've traced the core project, that radical attempt at personal coherence. We've identified the antagonist, that confluence of polite language, institutions, common sense.
And we've detailed the recurring demand. Adjust, soften, defer, or re-explain. That is how the system tries to rewrite you.
So what's the big takeaway here? This deep dive was about watching how one person uses really rigorous self-analysis to trace that incredibly fine line, the line between necessary life adjustments, which we all have to make.
And we have to function.
Of course. That line between necessary adjustments and facing demands that fundamentally rewrite your internal life until you don't even recognize yourself anymore. The focus is purely on locating the self amid all that polite systemic pressure.
That distinction adjustment versus rewriting, that is the most valuable lens we're getting today.
I think so too. It moves the conversation beyond just managing differences. It pushes us to see self-preservation against a force that's often masked as just efficiency or, basic manners. It encourages you to measure the hidden cost of those quiet demands.
Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you to carry forward. If that quiet demand the author identified is always to adjust, soften, defer, or re-explain, how do you define the boundaries of your own complexity? And how do you identify the moment when you are, quietly but firmly, refusing to disappear?